So as an overview of my remarks, I just wanted to lay out what our objectives are around integrating transportation demand management within the new development approvals and then the intersect with car sharing and transit. What are these TDM measures that are shaping good development? Looking at the framework, the policy framework, as well as some of the development approval process we need to go through around integrating TDM into our development approvals. And then finally, what I'd like to do is showcase TDM technical guidance that we've prepared here in Peel region. It's similar to approaches that have been applied in Hamilton, as well as in Kitchener-Waterloo, in Vancouver, in Halifax. Other areas are working on integrating TDM into new development. And then finally, some remarks around monitoring the actual work. So in terms of objectives, we'd like to, in the next few minutes, examine how a municipal land use planning authority can integrate these TDM measures, including car share services, within the land use planning and development approval process. So we have a vision. How do we make it become a reality? Ultimately, we're trying to support these, livable multimodal communities. The term complete communities is used. We like to use the term healthy communities, but at their core is a keen understanding of how people are moving around communities, and then looking at making those choices more sustainable, and then from a public health standpoint, really looking at active transportation. Transportation demand management, what does it really sort of mean? Series of policies, programs, services, products that ultimately are influencing travel behavior. So when we look more closely, we're looking at whether the trip is made, the purpose of the trip, the notion of the time when the trip is made, which can influence a lot of decision making around transit offering, transit pricing, so on. Where the destination ultimately being key. This notion of complete communities and shortening or making more sustainable journeys is founded in land use planning. So good land use planning, good transportation planning coming together. And then finally, the last box, the modality, how we're traveling. And it's really important to note that CUDA has recalibrated its vision, moving away from only transit to embracing these other modes. So moving away from this competitive nature to a more collaborative nature, I think, is key. So what do we mean by TDM measures shaping good development? Implementing it into the development planning, there's really two measures. The infrastructure, the hard measures, which are in part borne out by a lot of work that's done on understanding what the barriers to sustainable mobility might be, and trying to build those into developments from the start. So you're influencing that built form through urban design, greater mix of land uses. The proximity of those land uses to the transportation corridors is key to think about. And then ultimately we're thinking about choices, providing choices for people that are destined to these different locations that we're building. The second part of the TDM sort of measure sort of basket is around programming. So operational programs post-occupancy. Ultimately, the goal is influencing travel choice, and some of the examples, around parking management, community-based social marketing, and then in the Greater Toronto area, we have the benefit of having a transportation management association that we call Smart Commute, over 350 members representing, tens of thousands of employees. Just by linking a destination into the Smart Commute program, you can already start to see change in terms of mobility behavior at that site. When we're looking at TDM within the development approval process, there's really three important considerations. The first is that there's a robust policy framework upon which to build, some of the change that we're talking about. The first thing to note around the policy framework is that, the language that's used today in, official plans, official community plans, without exception, needs to be strengthened. So moving away from terminology that encourages towards requirement is key. The second consideration there around application and approval. So when we're doing this work, we're identifying these measures right at the pre-consultation stage with the applicant and the the planners on the file, and then ultimately processing the application towards approval and then implementation. Key on that is the pre-consultation, making sure that people understand what it is that's required of them. And then the final consideration in terms of the process is the monitoring. So occupancy inspection, some of the hard measures can be bundled together with that site, that final site inspection. The softer measures require a different approach. And that's something that we are continually sort of improving on. But just as a for instance, if we make a requirement for a business to be part of the Smart Commute Transportation Management Association, it's easy for the municipal authority to circle back with the TMA to understand whether the membership has been taken out and the level of activity and so on. So let's take a closer look at this technical guidance that we've come up with. But I think is applicable in a number of different contexts. So the first is that we're linking the demand management requirements right into the traffic impact assessment process, that TIS, traffic impact study or transportation impact study. And then ultimately what we've also done is created a TDM worksheet that helps planners bundle together some of these sustainable elements around mobility into one worksheet. Let's take a closer look at those. So the first is the traditional TIS approach, which is guided by site-generated trips based on IT trip rates. We're predicting what the situation is going to be like in the future based on what it's like today, and in a lot of cases that really fails us because we're not capturing what the changes that we're after and what the vision of some of the development needs to be. So if we look on the integrated TIS TDM approach, the key on this is moving through this is the mode share targets. So how do we want the site to function? So it's more of a backcast approach than it is a forecasting approach. And by that I mean that we have a vision in mind, we understand what the mode share targets need to be in the future, and we're going to build that site, parking supply, in terms of the background traffic, this notion of multimodal network performance. We're going to build those mode share targets right into the TIS so that we can actually have a plan that once it's built and once it's functioning has a greater hope of achieving some of those aspirational targets. The second tool that we've prepared to help with this is what we refer to as the TDM worksheet. It's very different than a checklist in that it allows the planner, principal planner on file, or in the case of a planning department that relies on their traffic engineering group, it allows them to understand the context, in terms of the nature of the transit systems available, the nature of the road network, and then applying the measures that are listed in the worksheet. We're respecting that context and then also respecting this notion of being pragmatic and practical. So for our purposes, we're looking at car sharing, integrating car sharing, and in our example, parking is the section that that car sharing finds itself in. The main reason why a developer is going to be providing car sharing vehicles, two reasons. The first is that they're looking to scale back on their parking requirements on the site, and there's lots of evidence to show that by introducing car share vehicles into a site, you can actually start to free up automobile ownership, reduce automobile ownership, and then correspondingly reduce parking requirements. And then the second one that's emerging is a resident amenity or a tenant amenity, and I'm sure that Pam and Aaron will share more of that as we go. The process needs to be predictable for developers to follow, and then ultimately a lot of these elements need to be negotiated. The policies around requiring some of these elements, depending on the context where you're working, the municipality you're in, can be very weak. And so I think it's incumbent upon us is to show the value that could be generated on the site by integrating TDM and, in this case, Carshare vehicles. So taking a closer look at the guidelines that we've prepared, you'll see that car sharing is identified as 1.4 on our worksheet. So reduce parking requirements based on the provision of car share vehicles. As we go deeper into the technical guidance, what we see is a corresponding technical guidance, for lack of a better term, that's provided on each one of the measures that's listed in the worksheet. In this case, it provides, some rationale for the planner, the current planning framework. In our case, we have something called the Peel Healthy Development Assessment Tool, and car sharing is embodied within that policy, which is now part of our official plan. And then the suggested practice. So this is based on, best practice. And so giving added insights to the planner on how car sharing can fit in. And then finally, some additional guidance. In this case, some examples of the car share reduction rates that are being applied in Toronto, New Westminster, Portland, San Francisco, just to give an appreciation of how other jurisdictions are tackling this. And then we've also got a sample car share agreement between the car sharing organization and the developer as an example. And then finally, looking at some of the supporting actions that need to be changed to support greater integration of car sharing and new development. Quick words on monitoring. I've already talked about the occupancy inspection for some of those hard measures. And ultimately, post-occupancy monitoring needs to be understood in that municipal context. Who are the right staff to be doing that work? And there are a number of methods that are used, including surveys to residents, tenants, post occupancy. Any of our smart commute work always begins with a travel study. And then, once the interventions or once the measures are laid out, in a year, 2 years time, a post survey is carried out. And then finally, just this notion of continuous improvement and capacity building. For some reason, in a Canadian context, transportation demand management isn't practiced that well. And we can take a look at some of the other types of utilities, whether it's energy or water, and how they manage demand, the peaking characteristics. And so we think that there's a lot of merit in applying transportation demand management to development, and then being cognizant of the fact that we're trying to develop these integrated networks and trying to ultimately address residents' needs. And then finally, if you're successful, something wonderful can arrive in your community. And in this case, it was the City of Mississauga example that I worked on personally to introduce car sharing into the downtown of Mississauga. Today, it's thriving, more cars, two companies are operating. And so it works, but the key is that we need the transit support on a lot of these schemes.